What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Inferno. Yes, our monthly series, which covers all the X-Men stuff. And in this video, we're actually going to get some huge revelations in terms of just what all's been going on here, and that not everything is what you expect it to be, which is exactly what I expected because it's Jonathan Hickman. So here's the thing. What this does is it goes all the way back to the beginnings of Krakoa. Now, if you guys recall, Cipher was just kind of like the guy who seemingly believed in Charles Xavier no matter what, right? That Cipher is the one that can basically discern any alien language whatsoever. And the whole basis behind Krakoa is that Krakoa itself was technically a mutant that merged with an island, but it's basically a living island. And that it made perfect sense as far as Charles Xavier is concerned, that if the mutants were going to have their own place to live, their own utopia, essentially, it should be an island that is in effect a mutant, and that Cipher would bridge the gap between the island itself and the mutant population, essentially be able to communicate with it on behalf of the mutant population and turn it into the utopia that they needed. And so where Cipher didn't initially understand everything that was going on, Xavier, of course, basically gave him like a mental image of what he imagined seeing, and then it was really up to Cipher from there to start building on it, right? To start turning it into something. Now, what we also end up finding out here is that along the way, Cipher, Doug had basically brought in Warlock. Now, Warlock we've kind of talked about before, but we'll sort of rehash this for a bit for people who are a little unfamiliar with that or don't really know who he is at all. So Warlock's a long-standing member of the X-Men community, and he's actually the precursor to the Phalanx, right? So what you had here is basically a group called the Technarchy, and they were essentially kind of like living machinery. Now, when Warlock arrived on Earth, that also coincided, well, really it was actually a few years later, but coincided with a guy named Cameron Hodge. The desire of Cameron Hodge, who was initially the benefactor of the original X-Factor team, is that he was so anti-mutant that he actually took what was in effect Warlock and then tried to merge him with human physiology, and by doing so created the Phalanx race as we know it. But that's kind of how Warlock ties into those things. Now, he's not really a member of the Phalanx itself. Instead, he's actually the son of the king of the Technarch and basically just fled because he didn't want to be confined to that life or anything along those lines. But the big thing here, the big important thing here is that Doug trusts Warlock implicitly, right? He trusts him absolutely, and for good reason, right? They've got a lot of history together. But one of the things that he says, and this is something that we weren't even aware of, is that when we initially read this, it was Xavier dropping off Cipher and saying, "Here you go, man, turn this into something that'll make the mutant nation proud." And Doug was like, "I'll do everything I can, Professor X." And then, Professor X left, and that was basically it. What we end up getting is the other half of that Doug never trusted Professor Xavier. He asked him, he says, "So, the professor has plans. Tell me, Warlock, do you trust him?" And the response of Warlock is, "No, self-friend. Experience says that we do not trust Charles Xavier." Now, that's an important thing to understand here. The X-Men, as they were originally written by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, and even in the early days of Chris Claremont, you look at Giant Size X-Men by Len Wein, there were basically a lot of reasons to trust Xavier. He was a bit of a creep because he had a crush on Jean Grey, which is really kind of strange because she's gotten older and he hasn't, so you really gotta wonder why in the world that works the way it does. But the thing about this is that Professor X, really the first major instance, I would say, of the mutant population distrusting Professor X, and really more the X-Men than anything else, I would say was probably X-Men Deadly Genesis. That was like a huge revelation when you ended up finding out between basically the defeat of the original X-Men team when Krakoa was first introduced in Marvel Comics, and like the new team that he formed in, I guess, Giant Size X-Men #1 by Len Wein. So like Colossus, Wolverine, Storm, all those characters coming together for the first time. That the X-Men Deadly Genesis story in the mid-2000s actually revealed that he had a secret mutant team that nobody knew about. Now, that's not to say that he was wholeheartedly trusted up until that point. There were a lot of instances when Xavier established the fact that either he was a dick or because of his mental state that he couldn't be trusted. So things like the Onslaught saga were a really big example, in the sense that he was so frustrated with humanity that when he shut down the mind of Magneto, Magneto's hatred for humanity merged with Professor Xavier's frustration with humanity and formed the Onslaught entity. So we've seen multiple instances over the years when Xavier's done some pretty nefarious stuff. And so it makes sense that even if they are kind of going with the idea, there is a little bit of distrust there. But we'll actually find out just how far-reaching this goes, because the first response that Doug has is, "Okay, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. For right now, we need to turn this into something." Now, following that, what you end up learning is that the island of Krakoa had in effect merged with Warlock, and this was all done in for an intended purpose. What that intended purpose is, we'll find out at a future point in time. But it's one of those things where Doug kind of having his secret conversations with, or I guess his personal conversations with the island of Krakoa, was always asking, like, how do you feel about the idea of being turned into an island nation for the mutant population. Then it turns into, how do you feel about like millions of mutants living here? Different things along those lines, right? That in a lot of ways, Krakoa seemed to kind of go with it, but didn't necessarily seem to be a big fan of it. But it was one of those things where it was really like Warlock and Krakoa and Cipher kind of working together in secret, so nobody would really know exactly what it was that they were doing. Now again, the role Warlock plays will become very important later on down the line. But one of the things to also know is that at the outset, the nature of Krakoa is that in order to sustain itself, it has to feed on life energy. And that's one of the reasons why Krakoa just kind of seemed to go along with that, is because as time progresses, what you would basically have is all these mutants occupying this place. And instead of feeding on the life energies of like 5 mutants, like he did in the original Giant Size X-Men #1, which I have, which was autographed for me by Jonathan Hickman and I'll never get rid of, that instead it can feed on the life energies of millions of mutants, but it can still sustain itself the same way. So tiny little bits of energy versus huge chunks of energy. So again, it's kind of an interesting thing, but of course, Doug working directly with Krakoa and all that kind of stuff, end up basically creating the Krakoan gates, which we're aware of. They allow the Krakoans, or at least the mutant population, to pass from one location to the next, all that kind of stuff. But along the way, all these discussions that they have, it always kind of seems to be that they don't necessarily trust Professor X. And all this comes to a head when it turns into what's basically the place where no one's supposed to know about, right? The place that Moira MacTaggert exists, kind of like a null space. We're sort of in Krakoa, but hidden away from Krakoa, and not even Krakoa itself can see it, right? In the sense that Doug basically says, like, this is going to create the habitat that they requested, the one that nobody can gain access to. Here's the kicker, right? He says, like, you, Krakoa, will not be able to see this. They've requested that. What they don't know is that Warlock has basically merged with you. So while you can't see it, Warlock can. So Warlock will be our eyes and ears on everything that's going on with regards to this little secret habitat, so we can know what's happening. And that's when we end up finding out that Doug Ramsey, right, and Krakoa and Warlock all basically know about Moira MacTaggert. And they know that Destiny's back, and they know that Moira MacTaggert wants to kill Destiny. And what this does is it confirms the suspicions that Doug Ramsey had, that Professor Xavier and Magneto cannot be trusted. While he doesn't seem to know the exact ins and outs of what's going on, because they don't discuss every single little nuance inside of this little secret habitat, he has solidified enough to know they've got some kind of secret plans that no one's supposed to know about, that they could in effect get the mutant population killed potentially. That's an important thing here. And so following that, you basically switch over to Destiny and Mystique, who have been summoned by Emma Frost. Now, this is a really, really cool encounter, right? Because Destiny died long before the Stepford Cuckoos were ever introduced, right? They describe themselves as a singular entity split into 5 parts. And of course, Mystique introduces them as 5 parts representing a singular entity. It's all the same thing. They're splitting hairs at this point, right? It's semantics, right? Like it's 5 + 2 versus 2 + 5. It's all basically the same thing. And so as a result of that, they kind of try to establish their dominance here to, a little bit like, no, Mystique, that's not what we represent. This is what we represent, which is basically the same thing you said, just saying it a different way. And so Destiny's like, do you know who I am? And they're like, yeah, like you're Destiny. They say you're the most powerful clairvoyant mutant to ever live. And she's like, yes. Do you know what I see when I look into the eyes of all 5 of you? And their question is what? And she says, I see 2 who will find love, 3 who will not, 1 who will be changed forever, severed from the 5 in Otherworld itself, and 1 of you will never recover from it, right? That was the nature of Destiny. She always answered in riddles. And one of the things that the Stepford Cuckoos kind of put off is that Destiny and Mystique can't possibly comprehend them, right? Because then at the end of the day, they kind of change who it is that wears like this black outfit so they could differentiate, or at least the rest of the world can differentiate between each of them, because the world just couldn't tell the difference if they all were white and so on and so forth. And so when the question is asked, like, well, which one of us is going to go through this? The response of Destiny is like, how would I know? There isn't any difference between any of you. You're all basically the same. Right? And then walks away. And it's one of those things where it's not like super significant, but it's basically Destiny busting the balls of the Stepford Cuckoos, right? The Stepford Cuckoos are getting shit tested by Destiny. That's basically what it is. Busting their balls to see how they react. But it's one of those funny little moments here, right? Because kind of going into that, the discussion that takes place between Emma Frost, Mystique, and Destiny is pretty significant here. And the reason why is because if you guys recall at the end of the last video, we basically talked about how Emma Frost was brought in by Professor Xavier and Magneto and given essentially the truth about everything that's been going on. But the fact that they'd held it from her for so incredibly long, despite the fact that she's been a long-standing member of the X-Men community, and that if anybody on the council has earned the trust to know what's going on, that it should have been her. It felt like a massive betrayal. It felt like they just didn't trust her. And so at the end of the day, she just ended up storming off. She, of course, wasn't going to blab their secrets to the world, so she wasn't going to work against them, but she wasn't going to work with them either. And that's what she establishes here, that she's very much on her own. And that's kind of how it's always been for Emma Frost, right? She's always kind of been on her own. The only exception to that is when she first encountered and really began to lead Generation X, or really when she first created and then led Generation X. Up to that point in time, even when she was part of the Hellfire Club, she was very much alone, right? She was very much isolated, just kind of a core part of her character. But what she basically tells Mystique and Destiny is that Moira MacTaggert's alive, and where they initially reject the possibility, she gives them just what is in effect a mental indication or a mental view of one of Moira MacTaggert's lives. Remember, all that information was given to Emma Frost by Professor Xavier, so she can pass it on to other people if she chooses. And so she basically shows Destiny and Mystique, this is the nature of Moira MacTaggert as a mutant, right? She is a mutant, she is not human. She has the ability to die and then resurrect. And that in and of itself is what makes her so powerful, is she can wipe away our timeline, right? All she has to do is just die and then do something different, and our timeline doesn't exist anymore. Now again, this is Marvel kind of changing the rules of time travel, that in years past, Marvel would have said, no, this timeline would just keep going. The new reality that Moira MacTaggert wakes up in is like a new timeline in and of itself. So, if you've got the first time Moira MacTaggert died, that's timeline 1. The second time she died, timeline 2. Third time she died, timeline 3, so on and so forth. But they never cease to exist. All those timelines keep going. Now, by all standards of measurement, they might as well not exist, because there isn't really a readily available means for the mutants to like hop from one dimension to the next, right? From one universe to the other. Other people can, right? But the mutants are very much self-contained. So unless they absolutely need the help of like Doctor Strange or the Fantastic Four, they won't really like leave and go explore other universes or anything along those lines. So while those doors aren't necessarily padlocked in the most extreme, they might as well be as far as the mutant population is concerned, because with the tools available to them, they can't readily jump from one universe to the next. And so that's kind of the crazy thing, is because at the end of the day, Destiny ends up realizing that while Emma Frost isn't going to necessarily work with them, she's not going to work against them, but she has brought things that they can use to basically help, right? Things that they can use to kind of work against Professor X and Moira MacTaggert to a degree, under the idea that everything they're doing will actually get the mutant population killed. And that's one of the funny things that Hickman really seems to be hitting at here, but doesn't really seem to be explicitly saying, is that, say for example, Moira MacTaggert were to die, right? She'll be fine, she'll live on, she'll continue on, and then she'll likely end up grabbing Charles Xavier and Magneto, and she'll kind of tell them everything that was going on. But Professor X will read her mind, he'll pass that information on to Magneto, and they'll essentially be all caught up. For everyone else, sorry about your luck, right? For the life that Emma Frost has formed for herself here, that's gone. For the life that anybody else has formed here, that's gone. That in a lot of ways, they all seem to be pawns in the game that Moira MacTaggert, Charles Xavier, and Magneto are playing. And that's one of the things, really probably the biggest thing, that pisses off Emma Frost more than anything else, is that they brought her in because they felt like they had to, not necessarily because they wanted to. And so basically this whole situation kind of unfolds with Moira MacTaggert coming out of her safe house, which exists outside of Krakoa itself. And once she emerges, she's immediately set upon by the forces of Orchis and then essentially whisked away. Now it's kind of a crazy thing, because once you transition over to the Orchis Forge, you basically pick up with Omega talking to Nimrod. And this is where things get interesting, because what happens here is that Nimrod has already picked up on the fact that Omega is not supposed to be here, right? That she's not part of this timeline. She's from somewhere else in the time stream. Now, this was like an itch that I couldn't scratch, because I knew I wasn't crazy. When I first started reading this, I was like, okay, I'm for the most part caught up on the X-Men. There's a few things that I'm missing here and there, but for the most part, I'm caught up. But how in the world did Omega go from the character that we last saw to this character here? What's going on here? And so what she basically reveals is that she's from the future, but the future she comes from, in all those different timelines, the mutant population always wins. And that's something that Jonathan Hickman had never actually specified. If you go back and you read House and Powers of X, that Moira MacTaggert seemed to come from it from the perspective that like the mutant population always loses. But then Omega comes along and says the mutant population population always wins. And so what it looks like is they're coming from two distinctly different sets of circumstances in terms of how the mutant, machine, and human war ends up unfolding. Either that, or one of them's lying. One of them's not telling the truth. And so because of this, she basically explains, at least in her timeline, how it all unfolds and in the various timelines that she seems to have experienced. Now, whether or not she's on the same capacity as Moira MacTaggert isn't really explained here. I would argue that's probably not the case, but the important thing here is that at some point along the line, the post-human race, right, the children of the vault, the ones that we'd seen that story on where like X-23 and Sync and them had gone into the vault and then like barely escaped with their lives, and like X-23 I think was the only one who made it out alive. I don't remember which one lived, but like those people there, so basically hyper-evolved humans, that they would emerge from the vault. The problem is they would emerge too early, and that Apocalypse would return from Oraco and basically slaughter them all. And then a war would break out between humanity and the mutant population, but the mutant population would start to gain the upper hand. In a last-ditch effort to basically win, the human population would create the Sentinel program, and then by extension, they would launch Nimrod. And that in creating Nimrod, it just wasn't really as powerful as they needed it to be, because at that point in time, what had happened is the mutant population was on the verge of complete and total destruction. Now, there was a side project going on, which we'll talk about here in a second, but the mutant population was basically on the verge of destruction. And so what would happen is that they would send Nimrod into the past with the hope that it could destroy the mutant population in its infancy, something akin to like Skynet and Terminator, right? Like basically what they were shooting for here, but that Nimrod would always fail. Now, here's the funny thing about this, right? If you go and you read New X-Men Volume 2, there's a 4-part story called Nimrod. And for years and years and years, people would debate whether or not that version of Nimrod that was fought in New Mutants Volume 2 was the same Nimrod, or like I guess the version of Nimrod that returned from like the old school days, right? From the Days of Future Past universe that went into the past and then basically merged with Master Mold in the Siege Perilous and then went on to become Bastion. What Hickman seemed to be doing here is saying, no, that version of Nimrod they fought in New Mutants Volume 2, that's this guy. It's this guy, and he's arriving in the past from this present here, right? From this future. So I don't know if that's true. He doesn't really say. All that we're really told is that that version of Nimrod goes into the past and then is ultimately destroyed, right? So again, we're not really given a definitive answer, but I feel like it'd be a very nice and elegant way to kind of answer that question that has really been plaguing the fan base since like the mid 2000s. But ultimately what would happen is that you would have humanity, which would merge with machine technology, kind of creating like the new post-humans. And that in doing so, they would begin to gain the upper hand on the mutant population. The problem with this is the mutant population had cosmic powers at their disposal, more specifically, the Blade of the Phoenix. Now, the Blade of the Phoenix is a sword that can only be wielded by Rookshire. Rookshire, of course, being a member of the Shi'ar Empire. And if you guys recall, what we've seen so far, especially at the beginning of New Mutants as part of the Dawn of X line, is that the mutant population formed an alliance with the Shi'ar Empire. Right now, Rookshire himself was actually a member of the Shi'ar who ended up basically gaining access, or was a host for the Phoenix Force. The Phoenix Blade can only be wielded by the descendants of Rookshire, right? Like his direct family line, people who share his blood. Anybody else who tries to pick it up will either be destroyed by it, or it'll just be a random sword. But they'll never be able to use it in the same capacity, using the full totality of what it can do with its small shard of the Phoenix, which is imbued to the sword. But in this future, during this war between basically the post-human race, the human-machine hybrid race, and the mutant population, that where the mutant population found itself on the verge of being destroyed, that what would happen is that post-humanity would basically draw the attention of the Phalanx race, right? That race out there that basically is kind of like this super advanced machine race that would achieve higher states of power. And they would literally travel around the universe after seemingly absorbing the cosmic entities, and then in turn start like turning various worlds to their cause. But once a planet had achieved a higher level of technological development, that the Phalanx would see them as worth assimilating into their race. And the Phalanx would arrive on Earth because of the attempt of the human-machine hybrid to draw the attention of the Phalanx, in the hope that one, the Phalanx would destroy what was left of the mutant population because they wouldn't see them as being worth merging with, and two, that the post-human race would find this kind of perfection by being merged with the Phalanx race itself. What would actually happen in these timelines, at least in terms of Omega's understanding of it, is that using the Phoenix Blade, the Sword of Rookshire, that the mutant population would actually destroy these phalanx individuals as they arrived on Earth. They would wipe them out. And because of the fact that they were using what was in effect godly technology, there was nothing the post-human race could do. So they would die off as well. And in the end, that's how the mutant population would reign supreme. That's how they would dominate everything. Now, in order to keep that from happening, which is a very reminiscent scenario from Days of Future Past, is that Omega's consciousness was basically sent into the past, into this body, for the purpose of allowing her to basically warn the human population, to ensure that humans could come out on top. So that's what really kind of blew my mind on this, is that in the original Days of Future Past timeline, it was the Sentinels that conquered North America and then eventually the world. And so basically humans and mutants were subjugated by the Sentinel population. And the Sentinels basically ended up just kind of going awry, just continuing on and then seemingly dominating everything. What this is basically the antithesis, that as far as Omega's concerned, this is essentially Days of Future Past, except it's humans and they're merging with machine technology, becoming post-humans that are essentially subjugated and eventually destroyed by the mutant population, and the mutants went out. And so much like the original Days of Future Past, her mind is sent to the past to keep this from happening. The way Kitty Pryde warned the mutant population that the assassination of Senator Moira MacTaggert, Robert Kelly, and Professor Xavier would lead to the launching or the return of the Sentinel program under Stephen Lang and eventually Days of Future Past, Omega's here to warn the human population of the mutants' impending victory. She's kind of working quietly behind the scenes. That Dr. Killian Devo was initially just a guy who was out there, but what ended up happening is that Omega actually developed what were essentially mind-altering glasses that led him to believe that he lived this life alongside her. And maybe he did, right? Maybe he actually did. We're not fully told if that's the case, but basically he ended up seeing the destruction of the human population, and that's why Orchis and all this is being done, is to ensure their own survival. And it's crazy because from here what you do is you actually transition to Terra Verde. That basically that's where Moira MacTaggert was taken when she was kidnapped by Orchis, and that Mystique and Destiny were seemingly given this information by Emma Frost. And that what happens is when they arrive on the scene, that it looks as though Moira MacTaggert has either been defeated or killed. But one way or another, it's kind of hard to tell. You basically end up having Destiny and Mystique, who were at this location, that seemed to be basically tormenting Moira MacTaggert. Again, we're not really sure if she is dead now. Like literally, you kind of have those moments when she's seemingly being tortured by Mystique and Destiny. So of course, she seems alive at that moment. But when you have Xavier and Magneto walk in, like her arm's just sitting there in a chair. So it looks like they did just lop her arm off and now they just got her in some other location, and that's basically it. But a trap has effectively been set, because when Xavier and Magneto walk in here, suddenly the teleportation portal starts activating. And when it does, you get a whole bunch of foot soldiers coming in, and then you get Nimrod. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.